We went to Japan,
Yeah.
Australia, New Zealand. I'm probably forgetting some of the places that we went to
Yeah.
present. Do you like traveling?
Have you ever thought about living abroad?
Well, in this episode, I'm going to share my experience of living and working overseas.
Stay tuned to see how a tech career can take you anywhere in the world. It's the Inside Guys. So, Wole, we want to talk about working and living overseas. And you definitely have experience in both. So, what we want to do is just ask a few questions like the interview so our audience can kind of hear how it came about, your
Yep.
experiences, challenges, because it's a very interesting story. So, you've been at Microsoft for almost 24 years. And part of the time, you literally moved overseas, worked abroad for about 4 years. So tell us, how did this come about? And is there something you've always wanted to do?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dave. So for me, I remember when I first joined Microsoft, working at this big multinational company, understanding that Microsoft had offices all over the world. So yeah, it's something that I thought about from the very beginning, as far as like, man, that would be cool to actually work at one of these offices in another country. At that point in my life, I had barely traveled outside of the U.S. Maybe I'd been into one or two countries, so I didn't have a lot of experience, but it sounded like something exciting and it was something I was interested in. But I didn't really pursue it per se. I was just in my comfort level of working here in the US. And what I did to scratch that itch of traveling overseas was to get myself invited to present at various Microsoft conferences overseas. And you were with me at most of those conferences.
Yep.
Um, we went to Japan,
Yeah.
Australia, New Zealand. I'm probably forgetting some of the places that we went to
Yeah.
present. And so that's kind of how I satisfied that curiosity of being overseas, but it wasn't fully living overseas.
Gotcha. All right. So let's talk about how that all came about, right? How did the opportunity present itself? How were you picked to move? How did you, let's say not pick so much as how did you position yourself so that the opportunity came to fruition?
Yeah, that's a great way to ask the question. So I'll say this, in I believe in life, we get opportunities presented to us in many cases when we aren't looking for them, and how you react in those situations when, again, you're not necessarily looking for something, but an opportunity sort of falls on your lap. How
Yeah.
you react determines a lot about what's going to happen next in your future. And so for me, I'm going to try to keep it really short, but I was at a conference. I was working at Microsoft, but I was at a conference for another company that is a Microsoft partner. And while I was at that conference, I was doing booth duty, which is not something I really like to do, but because it can be kind of boring.
Yeah.
But I was doing booth duty, and an employee of that other company, I'll go ahead and say who the company was. Dell. I was at Dell headquarters,
Yeah.
working at a Microsoft booth with 7 other Microsoft colleagues. And a Dell employee came to me and asked a question. He wanted to do some type of a deal with Microsoft at a specific customer, but he couldn't get a hold of the Microsoft account rep who he needed to work with. And since since I was bored, I just started asking him lots of different questions. And finally, the question I got to was like, hey, you need to be working with your Microsoft account executive, the Microsoft account rep. Are you working with that person? He mentioned the name of the person, but he said that person is no longer working here. He went to work for Microsoft overseas somewhere. And so that's why I haven't been able to move forward. So again, since I was a little bit bored, I started asking him a little bit more questions.
Yeah.
I asked him the name of the rep as if I could know who that person was.
Right.
Microsoft had
All 100,000 employees.
at that time, right? So, but I
Yeah.
just asked him, and it just so happened I knew that person. So
Ah, wow.
um, when he told me that this person was overseas, I was kind of surprised. But so I
Because
gave
let
him
me
my
say,
email address. And, hey,
you
go
didn't
ahead.
know that person had moved from these states to overseas for a
I
job.
had I had no idea.
Okay.
I had no idea. He's a person who I kind of knew a little bit through
Yeah.
going to internal Microsoft events. I didn't know him well at that time. But so anyway, I gave this Dell rep my email address, and then when I got back to my hotel that night, I looked in our email system to verify what this guy was saying, and
Mm.
he actually had he had the country wrong that he said the guy moved to. But I looked,
Okay.
and this guy was actually working for Microsoft in Istanbul, Turkey. So I literally sent him an email right then, and it was probably like, "What the heck are you?" Or maybe some expletive. "What are you doing over there?" And then
Yeah.
my email address is in my phone number, like most people, is in my email signature. 5 minutes after I sent that email, I got a call, and he told me that, "Hey, I moved over here 6 months ago. I've always wanted to work overseas. Here's how the opportunity came about, and the way we're hiring, you should come." So that's how it all started.
Okay.
I didn't
Right.
necessarily take it seriously at the time because I was kind of happy with what I was doing, but they were very persistent. He kept pinging me over the course of the next several weeks. "Hey, come over here for the interview. It's great. You'll love it." I didn't know anything about Turkey. He was working for Microsoft Middle Eastern Africa in
Okay.
Turkey. Istanbul was the headquarters at that time, which is why he was there. The role involved, from what I understood at the time, travel throughout the Middle Eastern Africa. So again, I always wanted to work overseas, so that was interesting. But I was very comfortable. Was trying to recruit me, and finally they put it in a way that they should have put it from the very beginning. His manager called me one time. He said, "Hey, just come over here for an interview, like a vacation, because you don't have
Mm.
to pay for your flight, you're not going to pay for food, you're not going to pay for
Right.
hotel, you're not going to lose vacation days because it's an internal interview." And I'm like, when I thought
Right.
about it, like if I had thought about it in that way, being someone who loves to travel, I would have said yes from the very beginning. So that's kind of how it all came about. There was a lot of serendipity that Dell rep who talked to me could have talked to 7 of the other people who were at the table.
Right.
He just so
Right.
happened talked. He just so happened to talk to me, and I could have stopped asking him questions at any point in conversation,
Right.
but I didn't. And that's an example of what I was saying. Sometimes these things fall in your lap when you're not expecting them, and you have to just react. So that's kind of the
Yeah.
background of how I came out.
Yeah, and that it goes back to one of our other episodes. If you guys haven't seen the one talking about networking, right? Because you were just networking on the spot, and you develop the
Yep.
contact, learn information, but you never don't lose on an opportunity to network with whoever you're talking to, because you never know what you may learn. So that's awesome. I don't think I knew that story.
Hey,
I've known
Dave,
you
I
for a
want to
long
hit on
time.
that point.
Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
want to hit on that point. Yeah. So on networking, because I told you the story of how I ended up there. We'll talk about this more because I know we're going to have an episode about networking. But and I'll just say his name. His name was DJ. So DJ, the person who was overseas before me, who ended up recruiting me, I asked him how he over the he had these internal, like most tech companies, we have internal conferences for training, sales, kickoff, national conferences, global conferences, and during those conferences, you have breakfast or lunch, and it's kind of a free for all. You go in there and you just choose a table to sit at. And you and I talked about this throughout my career. When I go to those conferences, I don't try to
Yeah.
sit at the table. I don't try to arrange to sit with my colleagues, people I always already know. I have
Yeah.
always been very intentional about going and seeking out people who I don't know from different countries, from different parts of the US,
Right.
from wherever. Just sort of like a passive networking, not super active, but just it is networking. So going
Yeah.
back to my friend who recruited me, that's exactly how it came about for him. He was at one of those conferences. He sat at a table with he happened to sit at the table with this person who became his future manager. He said,
Okay.
"What do you do? What do you do?" That person told him what he did. What DJ's experience was a great fit for the team that this person was trying to build, and they formed a relationship there, which led to him moving overseas. So
Right.
that's a true testament to the benefit of networking, getting out of the box, not getting not staying in your comfort zone, getting out to meet people who you have no idea who they are, because it can lead to great things.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So, all right. So you accept the position. So tell us a little bit about when you first arrived in Turkey, right? You've never lived in the country. I think you said you'd never been to the country. So you are day one. Just tell you how was that experience for you?
Man, it was rough, and I'll even go back before then. Making the decision to do it was rough. I mean, in the one breath I told you I always wanted to work overseas, but then when that opportunity actually presents itself,
Yeah.
man, it was tough because, like,
Yeah.
you know, you got to think about a whole lot of stuff. You're leaving behind your comfort level. You're leaving behind your friends and family, everything you know. You're
And you were
moving to a
single at the
completely
time,
new.
correct?
Yeah, yeah, and
Okay.
so I had the opportunity from a personal perspective. I've had the opportunity to do that,
Right.
so that wasn't holding me back. But it's just everything else is completely outside of my comfort zone. I didn't know anything about Turkey.
Yeah.
Um, the role that I was taking on was a new role. Everything was new. And I literally, in making the decision, I literally had to, it was such a tough decision for me. I had to take out a piece of paper and make a list of pros and cons. I literally wrote down pros and cons on a
Yeah.
piece of paper. And what helped me say yes was that when I looked at my list, all the things that were cons were short-term stuff, like,
Okay.
oh, I know I'm not going to know anyone over there, or it's a new role,
Right.
or something else is new. It's all stuff that could be overcome in not that long, and all the pros were long-term benefits. So that's when I looked at it on paper like that. That's how I ended up making the decision. Yes, but to answer your
Yeah.
question, and one other thing I'll say is, I don't know if you remember this, but we all met, you, me, and a couple of other friends met
Yeah.
up in
Yeah.
DC about a week or so before I was headed overseas. So that was great.
Yeah.
It
I
was a
remember
great
that.
sort of like partying celebration for me. But yeah, I mean, it was tough moving over there, leaving everything behind, everything that I know, my comfort level, my
Yeah.
parents, my friends, my family. When I moved over there, man, my head was spinning because everything was new. I'm moving to a country where the primary language is not English. Um,
Okay.
I'm in I obviously don't speak the language. I don't know the city. Everything is new. I was
Yeah.
afraid to drive there. The role was new. The team was new. I was still working for the same company, but in a different part of the company. The role involved traveling to a lot of other countries, which was exciting, but at the same time a little bit scary. Like, what's
Yeah.
what is the process of doing business in all these other countries that I have to travel to? Um, it was just a whole bunch of unknowns. And so I would say for the first 6 months I was there, it was really tough. I mean,
You said
definitely
6
I went
months.
through first 6 months. Yeah,
6 months.
definitely a lot of
Okay.
growing pains. I
Yeah.
remember looking out of the window of my apartment. I remember distinctly looking out of the window of my apartment, asking myself, "What the hell did you get yourself into?" Because the way it works at Microsoft is, when you leave one role, and this is going to be the same for any company,
Yeah.
you leave one role and you go take on a different role. I wasn't necessarily committed. I didn't have any commitment to stay in my new
Mm.
role for any period of time. If I hated it in 2 months, I could have left. However, I would have to find a job back, right?
Right. That's right. You
So
vacate your position.
there
Yeah.
wasn't a job waiting for me. So,
Right.
I felt like there were a lot of roles back in the US. And so, and I didn't want to quit, obviously.
Right.
But at the same time, you have a lot of thoughts going through your head, just, you know, loneliness, not knowing a lot of people. I'm a social person, as you know. And
Right.
so not having a social circle right away, a strong social connection with folks was tough for me. And then again, being away from physically being away from my family and friends,
Right.
that was tough, man. So it was definitely tough.
Yeah, yeah, you were brave. I remember we at one point we were all talking about let's do a stint overseas somewhere, or go, and you were the first one that I personally had a connection with and knew that went out and did it. So you definitely were setting you took networking to a whole nother level, and then executing on something you wanted to do. So you said there was like some short term things that you had to overcome, and it's a new job, a new area. So talk about a little bit. What are some things you did to educate yourself on okay, what should I be doing in this role? How do I do business in Turkey and these other countries? What was your process to close that knowledge gap that you did have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I relied on people who were there. So there were, I met a lot of great people on in the company, including my friend DJ. He was someone who's kind of took me under his wing and showed me around, both from a professional perspective as well as sort of introducing me to the new country I was in. Ended up living in the same building that he was in. We had a really, really nice apartment. I can talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, he actually during my interview, he showed me his apartment, as part of, he probably did it deliberately, but when he showed me where he was living, I was like, oh wow, this is really nice. So, but anyway, for me, I think everything turned for me. Well, let me actually talk about some of the challenges I experienced were, um, when you go to a foreign country, things don't work the same way they work in your country. Like, it sounds obvious, but it wasn't something that was top of mind for me. So for example, just going to the grocery store for the first time, I realized like it's not set up in the same way. I'm lost, right? Turning on my cable TV, getting a bank account, like everything was different. Going to restaurants don't operate in the same pace as
Right.
restaurants in the US. So, for example, in Turkey specifically,
Yeah.
you can be in a restaurant for a little while before maybe they take your order. But conversely, they're not rushing you out like when you're in a restaurant here in the US by
Yeah.
uh there's a system, that
Yeah.
hey,
It's
by this
totally
time they should
different.
come take my order. By this
Right.
time they should get fill my drink. By this time
Right.
they should ask me if I need it. You cut there's a system, right?
Yeah.
And then
Absolutely.
at a certain point, they're like asking you, do you need anything else? In other words, they're trying to flip that table so you can get out. Over
Right.
there, it's not that way. You can just you could. I've been in restaurants 4 hours, man, just with friends, hanging out,
Right.
enjoying.
And there's no
So
problem. Yeah.
yeah, so just getting used to that. So for me, when things turned around, I'm giving you a long-winded answer, but when things turned around is when I made a mental mind shift and tried to stop making everything, stop expecting things to be the way they were in the U.S. and
Gotcha.
accepting the differences and seeing the goodness in the differences in where I was. By the
Right.
same token, when I first moved there, um, my initial friends who I gravitated to were all Americans, right? Because we
Right.
shared, in my thinking, we shared like common culture. We definitely shared a common language,
Yeah.
um, etc. But when I thought back, a lot of these people who were my friends when I first moved there, they wouldn't have necessarily been people I would have hung out with if I were in the US. I was just
Mm.
with them as a comfort level. So
How
again,
did
I
you
made
meet
that
those
mental.
friends? Just talk about it a little bit. So how did you even make, because people say, well, how did he make friends? Like how did you what was the process you went to even connect with those people?
Yeah, what's interesting? That's a great question. It's the same way I made friendships in the US. So
Mm,
so initially most of my friends were Americans or Canadians or
yeah.
Brits. Again, just like the language thing. But I would say that was more of a forced thing. So they have like expat communities in all these in pretty much
Yeah.
every country. And so in Turkey's no different. There's a lot of for example, English teachers there, people who moved from the US to teach English in schools there, or people
Right.
who obviously other multinationals, people like that. And so they have expat gatherings. And so I was going to those as a sort of social connections. But
Gotcha.
um, when I hit that 6 month mark, when that sort of mental mind shift happened, is when I started making friends. So my friendship shifted from like 90% like American to like 90% Turkish. And to answer your question, where did I meet all these new Turkish friends? Well, it was in the same ways that I met friends in the US. So, one of the first things I did when I moved there is I joined a gym. Um,
Mhm.
and so I ended up making a lot of friends at my gym, just like in the US. A lot of my
Right.
friends were from the gym. I had a
Right.
couple of friends from work, people
Common
who I connect.
interests.
What
Yeah.
was that?
Common interests you were looking for.
Exactly, common
Yeah.
interest. So I had some friends from work who we ended up like you're a great friend of mine who out of all the people who I work with, we connected because we had
Yeah.
common interests in the same things. I met some Turkish friends who I had common interests with, and
Right.
so and then after that, it just like kind of multiplies. You make friends of friends of friends like that. So,
Yeah.
but it was just like that common interest.
Gotcha. All right, good. That's good. It's interesting how you say you stopped thinking about way things were back home and said you were here, and his old phrase, let's start get living where you are, right, and appreciate
Exactly.
where you are. Um, so you talked about some of the issues. I want to ask you something I know a lot of our viewers are thinking. Did you experience any issues as an African American male in Turkey? So any racism, any bias, anything, being an African American male from the US, talk about if there were any issues that you experienced in that particular area.
That's a great question. Um, and I think we should deal with this type of question openly. And I know we're gonna
Right.
we're gonna do that in our channel as it relates to the tech industry. But yeah, I did not, man. So I had a wonderful experience, man. I did not experience racism. I didn't experience any negative bias. Um, Now, was I in situations where people would stare at me because I'm
Yeah,
different?
right,
Absolutely. That happened. That happened often. Sometimes it happened like multiple times a day. I'm talking about outside of the office. In the office, I'm working for
right,
multinational, so none of that
right.
happened. But sometimes when I'm out and about, it would happen, and then sometimes I would expect it to happen when I was out and about, and it wouldn't happen. So it's kind of unpredictable.
Yeah.
The way I dealt with it is, again, I think this is all about your mind state and putting in really perspective. So I chose to, when I'd be in situations where people were staring at me, I made a deliberate decision to look at it in a positive way, because I'm like,
Mhm.
I'm in a place where this can happen at any point. Am I going to get
Right,
upset every time it happens? No.
right.
So I just reflected on it in a positive way. So I for better for worse, I told myself they're staring at me because I'm interesting, or they're staring at me because I'm sexy,
Mhm.
whatever.
A
I
positive spin on it.
I
Yes.
look, and that's my personality. I think that's how you
Right,
have to be in general in life. But
right.
that's how I took it. So living in a country where there are not many black people, of course, that's going to happen, but
Yeah,
it wasn't negative. And as a matter of fact, to me, it turned out to be a positive, because it made it more. It actually made it interest. It made it easier for me to meet interesting people. I
gotcha.
met movie producers. I met professional athletes,
Yeah,
soccer players. I met a lot of people. But so if you kind of learn how to use some of these things to your advantage,
right.
it can actually be a positive. So that's kind of how I chose it to deal with it. And then when it comes to, that's about living in that country. As you know, I was traveling to lots of different countries throughout the Middle East. So
Yeah, yeah.
I can't even count the number of countries I visited. So obviously, when I was in Africa, that wasn't an issue. But let's say when I'm in a country in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia,
Yeah,
UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, Israel. I'm in these countries. It wasn't an issue. I think for me it was refreshing, because I would say a lot of the biases that might exist in the U.S., they just don't exist there, because the
true.
history isn't there. So
Yeah, true.
uh, I was treated as a professional. I was treated as an expert. If anything, I would say in my situation when I was there, um, having an American accent made me, for whatever reason, it made me authoritative. You know what I mean? So people
Interesting.
like listen to
Interesting.
me
Right,
because I was coming from Microsoft's biggest subsidiary in the world, which is in the U.S., and so
right.
people just assumed I knew what I was talking about, and hopefully I did for the most part.
Yeah, hopefully they were right, right? That's good. So you took a situation that you could have taken negatively, but you turned to a positive, and it worked for you. You actually met more people. People were engaged. So I guess the message is for us, the folks that look like us, and African Americans, especially young people that travel abroad. Don't assume they're looking in a negative way. A
Right,
lot of times they may be looking because you're interesting or you're different or unique. And not to say that some stares are, are having negative, but it's really how you carry it and how you spin it. And I'm glad to hear
that's
you
right,
took it well.
that's right.
So talking about our last question to wrap things up, your overall experience, what would you say you took from the experience? And then what would you say to others who one, have never even thought about it, and two, they thought about it, but they just said, "Oh, it's just that's too much change. I don't want to do it." How would you summarize that?
Look, man, I think it's all about getting out of your comfort zone, growing out of your comfort zone,
Yeah,
and extending yourself. I mean, for me, that's I told you about how I ended up making that decision to move to Turkey in the first place. As you know, after I was in Turkey, I moved to Dubai. So I was in Dubai after that. That
yeah,
was a different place as well. I made that decision to move for professional and other reasons. Um, but I mean, it's about getting as I said, is extending yourself, growing. You're not going to truly grow as a person or professionally unless you are willing to stretch yourself. So that's
yeah,
the advice. And then on the other hand, what we were talking about earlier, as far as um, dealing with having a positive mindset around how you deal with these types of situations, whether it's
yeah,
you being a different person in the room, not assuming the worst.
yeah,
And you know what? I wonder if any of the viewers there have been in this situation. Have you been the only person? Have you been a unique person in a room or in a situation, whether it's overseas
yeah,
or in a professional situation? How do you deal with it? How has it affected you? So comment, please. We'd love to see comments around those types of experiences you may have had.
yeah. And if you have any questions for Wole, just some details about how he got started, details on how he overcame some of those things, please, ask in the comments. We look forward to that because it is a unique experience. I think a little more common today, but when you did it, we're not going to date you how old you are, but that there wasn't a lot of us going out and doing that. So that was huge back then. It's a little easier now. You can go on YouTube and what is it like to live in Turkey and traveling while black. There was none of that,
Right. No,
when
no,
you
no.
when
We
you
were
did this. Yeah,
we were on the frontier, man. I mean, it
yeah,
was just one thing I'll say though is that to your point, like we have a little bit more information.
yeah,
I didn't have really any information, and quite frankly, I didn't have negative or positive biases. I just was kind of like a blank canvas, not knowing what to expect. It's only when I got there for my interview that I saw the country, and I saw, oh, this is actually a nice place.
yeah,
Um, our situation that we in the Microsoft perspective, from working for Microsoft overseas, we got a housing allowance. So I was in a really, really nice apartment
nice.
building
Yeah,
with we had a gym in the apartment building. We had our own movie theater. We had a restaurant. So yeah, it was a grocery store right behind us, a big grocery store right behind us. So when I saw all that, uh, I was living at a very high standard, not
yeah,
something that I had even imagined. Same thing when I was in Dubai, housing allowance, car allowance. So there can be benefits outside of the professional and personal
yeah,
benefits. So I encourage everyone to to at least consider the opportunity. Today's point, there's a lot more information now.
yeah.
So to me, there's even less reason to, if you're thinking about doing it, there's less reason to hesitate.
Right. Very nice. Very good. Well, thank you, Wale. We appreciate you going through your experience. Definitely was inspirational.
Great
And
questions, man. Great questions.
no problem. If you've gotten this far, viewers, please like, subscribe, comment. If you have any more questions, some things you'd like to see in future episodes as well. But we're going to make it a wrap. It's the Inside Guys. We'll see you next time.